I'm excited to have our lunch keynote speaker join us today. We decided that instead of just reporting on medical device things, we'd give you some food for thought. And so I'm not going to go into a full introduction, but please join me in welcoming Alex Moazed.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me here today. It's a fantastic organization and gathering that you have. And so what we're going to talk about for a little bit is modern monopolies in the medical industry. Traditional monopolies like Standard Oil or Ma Bell, you may not associate the idea of them reducing costs while improving quality. The new modern monopolies actually deliver exactly on just that. So hopefully I'll grab your attention for a little bit over lunch. So the top 5 market cap companies in the world are all platform businesses. They are all these new modern monopolies. There are many other platforms, many other modern monopolies following these top 5 companies, 2 of which now are actually worth $1 trillion. Amazon, I think this number is 2 years old, has tripled in value in 2 years. And the reason why this business model is so powerful is because they make more money than all the other types of business models. If you look all the way on the right, their profit margins are higher. Immediately to the left, linear tech would refer to traditional SaaS technology companies. Think about an Oracle, someone that has software and is charging some kind of a subscription. On the other side of the screen, on the left side of the screen, you'll see their valuation multiples. These are also the highest. And then you'll see service and product companies farther over to the left. So how are these platform businesses able to command these profit margins and these valuation multiples? Well, it's because they have these things called network effects. And these network effects enable them to have winner-take-all dynamics, hence this whole idea of modern monopolies. So the top left here is video consumption in the United States. Netflix has spent a lot of money on research that if you look online, you'll see a bunch of charts saying, oh, Netflix has more bandwidth usage than YouTube. But if you count regular engagement, number of users, and how frequently they engage, YouTube is far and above the dominant player in video consumption in the United States. Then the top middle is desktop operating systems between Windows and Apple. Top right is e-commerce in China. Alibaba has a series of different product marketplaces. JD.com is a linear, more traditional e-commerce reseller, which I'll get into exactly what that means in a minute. And bottom right is smartphone operating systems between Android and iOS. Bottom left is Google US search. Magically, Google has this number below 70% in the United States. It's funny how that always happens. If you look internationally, that number is actually much greater than 70%. So these business models are able to have this winner-take-all dynamic because of their network effects and what we'll get into in a moment. But there's never a third-place winner, right? No one wants to be the Windows Phone. So that's pretty much the main takeaway from this first part of it. And the book that I co-authored called Modern Monopolies, the subheader there says, what it takes to dominate the 21st century economy. The answer to this riddle is platform business models. So let's dive into what they actually are and how they work. So platform businesses create value by facilitating exchange. Instead of having one customer group, which everyone in here has, they have at least 2. And that second customer group is what we would call producers of value, right? So you have consumers, which have been around for ages, but now you have these third-party producers that are creating value. And the platform creates value by facilitating exchange between consumers and producers. So Airbnb, Their producers are homeowners who are putting inventory into Airbnb's centralized marketplace. eBay, their producers are product manufacturers or distributors or resellers that are putting that inventory into the marketplace, right? None of that inventory that eBay or Airbnb is quote unquote selling is actually on their balance sheet. It kind of gives them this asset light model that you would attribute to platforms. YouTube, same thing, but with content. Third-party content creators putting videos and media into YouTube, of which YouTube is not held responsible for the IP infringement rules that come along with that content. PayPal, you have this idea of a prosumer. I could send and receive money, and essentially I'm performing both functions of consuming and producing value in exchanging money. So platform is used a lot these days, but when we are using it, we're referring to it as a business model, not a product, not a piece of technology, which is what it's commonly used to describe. If you think about computing platforms or industry platforms like the Intel chipset, right? There's a bunch of products built around that chipset that make all those products work homogeneously with one another. Product family platforms like a car body that's reused across multiple product lines. Platform as a service like infrastructure as a service, if you think about computing, storage, or processing power. But again, these businesses, these products are simply just that, a product or a technology. They're not in the business of helping to facilitate that exchange of value. So what do we call these not platform businesses? Well, we call them linear businesses. And you can think about this in a pretty traditional sense. I have a product, I have raw materials, I have people on payroll that are creating a product, distributing that, or providing a service and selling that service. Procter & Gamble creating products, using distributors to distribute and bring those products to market. Toys R Us buying products as a reseller and then reselling those products. Ford creating cars and having dealers as their distribution channel. Netflix is one that commonly is mistaken. We've written quite extensively why we think Netflix is going to have a lot of problems over the next 5 years. They are linear in the sense that they are spending about $10 billion a year buying or licensing all of their own content. And as that field gets more and more competitive, which it is, they don't have the benefit of what comes from that network effect, right? All their supply is controlled and paid for by them. That becomes very expensive over time. So the next graphic here helps to kind of understand more in depth about the different types of platforms. Exchange versus maker platforms at a high level. There's 8 different versions of them in here. We won't get into all of them today. But if you take a step back and think about what are some of the key differences, maker platforms comprise of development platforms. If you think about iOS or Android, your producers are third-party software developers. Content platforms are also in this bucket. And there's a one-to-many network effect, right? For every app or video that I create, I want millions and millions of people to use and consume that digital produced value. The exchange side is a little bit different. It's more of a finite transaction, more of a one-to-one model. If I'm an Uber driver or if I'm renting my home on Airbnb, there's a very finite amount of value that needs to be coordinated and match-maked with demand. And so the platforms on the exchange side are really helping to bring liquidity to those markets and balance supply and demand in hopefully as much of an instantaneous process as they can. So that's a little bit about platforms. We're going to have some Q&A time at the end. Definitely want to get feedback as we go, or towards the end. What does this mean in the medical supply industry? Well, first and foremost, the distribution channels are under heavy attack by a company you may have heard of called Amazon. And if we rewound the clock a couple of years ago, you may say to yourself, Amazon isn't in the healthcare and medical industry, just like they weren't in the food industry with food that will go bad if it's not stored properly. There's a lot of heavy logistics and barriers to entry in terms of figuring out that business model. Same thing with the healthcare industry or the financial services industry. There's a lot of barriers to entry. We are protected. These platforms, these modern monopolies can't get in. Well, not so much the case. And when Amazon wants to get into a field which they have a very big reason to want to get into healthcare, they can and they will. So, ironically enough, Amazon didn't even need to buy anyone to get into the medical supply distribution industry. They actually just built it from scratch. And it's taken them a few years after they launched Amazon Business. Amazon Business is now a top 20 B2B distributor. That's across all different verticals of B2B distribution, from industrial supplies to electrical supplies to metal distribution, and of course, medical supply distribution. Funny enough, if you look on the left side of this chart, you'll see the three biggest names are all in your industry. McKesson, Cardinal, right? These large healthcare and medical supply distributors are right at the top of Amazon's list to go after. So fortunately, there's a lot of precedent. Amazon was founded in 1994. There's a lot of lessons learned that we can apply from B2C and early learnings of how they've gone and made progress in B2B distribution that we can apply. The one thing to note here is while you see Amazon Business at over $10 billion in GMV, so traditional distributors will report revenue. GMV stands for gross merchandise volume, so that includes whatever Amazon is reselling as a traditional distributor, so that would be revenue. GMV accounts for all the third-party products that are sold through the Amazon marketplace. Technically, that's not revenue. The revenue are the fees that Amazon derives from that third-party product being sold, but GMV essentially encompasses that total throughput through the marketplace. So at $10 billion of GMV, the startling fact is that Amazon Business is growing at 20%. Not 20% a year, not 20% a quarter, but 20% every month. So when you annualize that, that means this chart is going to look very different next year. So these are a few interesting things that have stuck out to me when we dive a level deeper into medical supply. 75% of U.S. healthcare executives in a recent survey said they expect Amazon Business to disrupt medical supply distribution. Not that they might or they think they will, but that they fully expect Amazon to disrupt. 100,000 is if you went on Amazon Business right now and you looked at the search for the different number of SKUs, you would find over 100,000 different SKUs of products that would qualify as a variant of a medical supply that they are currently selling and distributing today. This last one is an excerpt from a quotation from Chris Holt. He's Amazon's global healthcare lead. And this is where he's describing how they want to serve doctors and healthcare providers. And what he's saying is, we don't just want to sell doctors industrial supplies and everyday supplies. We want to sell the doctors all the medical products that they, the docs and healthcare providers, consume. Full stop. And they're doing it already. Okay, so what does that actually mean? Let's peel back that onion another layer here. So we're talking about product marketplaces again. And the first step to understand and really help to internalize what this threat means to everyone in the room is a frank conversation around commoditization. If you look at your product catalog and think about how commoditized are my products or how non-commoditized are my products, that's one of the first places to start. If we look at how Amazon Business has penetrated already, what they tend to do is go after that long tail spend, that 20% of spend, which is very disparate or fragmented or applied across a variety of different channels. That's where they've started. Typically, you'll find highly commoditized products in that spend. Think disposable, consumable products. Think about products that could be manufactured by hundreds of different manufacturers. Right? Typically, these are pack and ship products that could be housed in just a handful of warehouses and centrally distributed all across the country. From a logistics and a fulfillment standpoint, it helps to simplify a lot of things. Okay, now if we think 5 years out, what happens to these highly commoditized products? A lot of them literally go away with programs like Amazon Basics, where Amazon just says, hey, I'll take a white label manufacturer and I'll just sell this myself and I'll call it Amazon Medical Supplies. So that obviously is not what everyone here is selling. It may be a part of your product catalog, but certainly at the size and scale of many of the folks in this room, at the very least margin compression, or at the greater extent full replacement, would be a pretty bad scenario. On the other end of the spectrum here, for the less commoditized products that you are selling and creating, what you will see is margin pressure. And the reason that you get this margin pressure is because Amazon has essentially democratized access to your customers. What does that mean? If you think about a new medical device startup getting access to your customers, it's not that clear how to do it. It's actually pretty difficult. The distribution channels are pretty gray matter. The pricing is certainly not transparent. There's a lot of barriers to entry that maybe wouldn't make much sense to an outsider, but certainly to everyone in this room, you are pretty intimate with all of them. What Amazon is doing is leveling the playing field, and they're saying, hey, any product manufacturers, you can get access to the distribution channels just like any of the traditional incumbents. Because what I want to do as the platform is I want to provide total product choice to my customers. And I want to provide total pricing transparency and total pricing competitiveness to my customers. Because if my customers win, I, Amazon, win. And usually that means that the producers lose out over the long term. Actually, it's pretty much exactly what it means. So if we look at this company, Anchor, they are obviously on the B2C side creating electronics. So not kind of rinky-dink products. These are definitely complicated electronic products. And this company was started by an ex-Googler with under $100,000 about 3 years ago. And they are now a multi-billion-dollar company. Interestingly enough, they didn't even make a website. They said, all I care about is Amazon. All I'm going to do is make billions of dollars of revenue on Amazon in less than 5 years. Those traditional distribution channels are already being eroded. Not that they will be eroded. They're already being eroded. Let's look in the bottom left here. Customer rankings and reviews on Amazon have become just about the most important factor in how consumers buy electronics products. Amazon is slowly strangling brand names, how Amazon steers shoppers to its own products. Basically, the brand equity that everyone in this room has built up over many, many decades is also being diluted, along with the distribution channel. Now, consumers, this includes business consumers, are being trained to look at other factors than brand recognition, ratings, reviews, the quantity of those ratings and reviews, and transparent pricing. So ultimately, there's going to be many more device manufacturers in the future, without a doubt. And there's going to be a lot more startups that have easier access to capital because the matrix of making their way to distribution to the end customer is now a lot simpler, and it's a lot easier for VCs to understand how to fund those businesses. Actually, a lot of private equity companies are getting in on this as well. So not so fun stuff. The good news, sorry, go into that over lunch, is you actually have a lot of opportunity. It all depends on how you look at it. However, if you look at this company and follow what this company is doing, they're not going to help you. They'll actually just lead you right into a bottomless pit of suffering. Grainger is the exact example of what not to do. They have been publicly identified by Amazon in court documents that they didn't want released, that Grainger is a key target and, quote unquote, I think a green field of opportunity that they are literally sprinting after MRO, industrial supply distribution, over the next couple of years. Why? Because on a recent earnings call, the Grainger executives were saying how over 90% of their products are centrally distributed. I was listening to that and cringing. Those are the absolute last things that you should be bragging about. Instead, what Grainger will refuse to do is disrupt themselves. This is a classic case of the innovator's dilemma. Every distributor is currently facing this. They have an old business model. Amazon has the new business model. Will they literally commoditize their existing business model to compete with Amazon? And so far, the answer from quote unquote, leaders in B2B distribution is no, absolutely no. Instead, what they will do is tout their e-commerce performance, linear e-commerce, traditional reselling model, And if you look at their stock price over the past year and a half, it's actually doubled. But do not attribute that to their ability to combat and beat Amazon. Instead, attribute that to a strong economy. Their ability to compete against Amazon, when you dig into the numbers, is not there. A lot of their growth is coming internationally, and what they're seeing in the United States is margin compression, as opposed to growth and margin expansion. They're not winning. Instead, what they're doing is delaying an inevitable future where a marketplace is dominant, and where they will refuse to let third-party sellers, who have been their fiercest competitors for decades, to let those third-party sellers into their websites and into their marketplace. They have and probably will continue to refuse to do it, as they're literally letting the enemy in through the gates. What they are failing to understand is that those are old enemies and new customers. And what that will do is make the end customer, the doctor and the healthcare provider, win. And when they win, marketplaces win. So unfortunately, you can't look to your distributors to figure this out. Instead, you need to look at everyone else in this room. So Walmart is a good example of someone that has listened and has figured this out. In 2009, they tried to create Walmart Marketplace, and it failed because really they couldn't find the right separation. It's a new business model, the core business model. The core business model ended up stifling the new business model, and it didn't work out. But at least they tried it. Doug McMillon, 7 years later, said, we're going to go buy Jet.com for $3.3 billion. To pay for this acquisition, not cheap, they opened the fewest stores in 25 years. And then they doubled down on this strategy, buying Flipkart for about $16 billion earlier this year. Within 12 months of buying Jet, when they bought Jet, they had about 15 million SKUs online. Within 12 months, they had 60 million SKUs. They didn't go and buy 45 million SKUs worth of inventory to beef up their digital e-commerce approach. No, they let a marketplace come in, they let third-party sellers come in and expand that total product choice. Oh, and the 15 million SKUs that they did have already got even more pricing competition. Customers are happy. As a result, in Walmart's latest quarterly call, they announced that they had a 40% quarterly growth in their digital e-commerce sales in the United States, which is massive, and blew away Wall Street. So that doesn't mean that you need to be a Walmart to compete with Amazon. Actually, in the B2C space, we've seen vertical-specific B2C marketplaces. You can see all these little boxes here, things like clothes or furniture or watches. And some of these startups are actually public. Farfetch here is about to go public for about $6 billion. If anyone here is familiar with the fashion goods industry, in order to get the hottest products, you kind of need to buy the not-so-hot products. Farfetch doesn't buy any inventory, right? They aren't like Net-a-Porter, which is that linear reseller e-commerce model. Ironically, every traditional fashion house has pretty much invested in Net-a-Porter. None of the traditional fashion houses want to invest in Farfetch. Why? Because it's the new model of doing things, and they don't like it. But Farfetch has a much stronger business model, is worth much more money, and has much better profit margins. Which one would you want to choose if you were that startup entrepreneur? You also have Zulily here down in the left next to Jet. Zulily was actually acquired by QVC, right, for those kind of everyday general shopping deals. So the other good news is that the companies, the traditional businesses and device manufacturers in here actually have a lot of advantages, especially compared to what those startups had to deal with. So user acquisition, one of the biggest challenges for a platform is this, what we call this chicken and egg game, right? If I'm Uber, in order to get customers, I need drivers, and drivers to get customers, and the cycle just continues to repeat itself. You have a huge existing customer base already around. You actually have a huge product catalog already that can help seed supply on these kinds of marketplaces. You also have a brand. If we look at point 4 here, very hard for a startup to build brand and trust, especially in this industry. Deep industry knowledge about what are those adjacent or complementary products that my customers want. How should we be expanding this marketplace? Funding, access to capital markets, and platform leakage. A lot of transactions tend to try and escape out of the platform. They meet on the platform, they transact outside of it. There's a lot of tools and services that you are already providing today. If you think about warranty programs, customer service, financing options, a lot of these tools and services lend themselves very well to the types of tools and services that a platform or a marketplace can benefit from to keep these transactions inside and growing. So linear companies that have actually gone and built their own platforms, ironically enough, Amazon started out as a linear reseller of books. It took them over 10 years, they started in '94, to actually start letting third-party marketplace sellers in. They needed initial demand to actually have enough demand that it would attract those third-party sellers. Klockner on the bottom right here is a $7 billion metal distributor that spun out XOM Metals earlier this year, which is a marketplace for metal distribution. So basically what I would say is if the metal industry is figuring this out, I think the medical supply industry can figure this out. Siemens is doing this from a development platform standpoint, so letting software developers build software not only on top of their machines and their connected devices, but their competitors' machines and connected devices as well. And if you don't want to build, you can buy. Sotheby's bought Viet, a furniture marketplace, earlier this year. QVC bought Zulily, which I mentioned. Samsonite's an interesting example, buying eBags, which of course sells many other types of luggage besides Samsonite and Tumi, but it also sells things like handbags and other product categories that are complementary or things that Samsonite doesn't sell at all. Conde Nast is an interesting one here at the bottom. Conde Nast bought Reddit for a fraction of what it is worth today. It recently surpassed Facebook.com as the third most trafficked desktop website in the US and is worth close to $2 billion. So a traditional publisher, magazine company, actually was able to bring a lot of synergies to help Reddit get to where it is today. So leaving things on a not so positive note, so if you have less commoditized products that are maybe more electronic and have a lot of software in them, then maybe the threat is less so from Amazon and more so from Google. And what Google loves to do is what we call commoditize the complement. They basically take software and give it away in access to the network. So software is the commodity, the value is in the network. That's pretty much one of the core philosophies of platforms. They did this with Android. They bought it for $50 million, put 2 years of R&D into it, went to the handset manufacturers and said, here you go, we're going to give this to you for free to compete against the iPhone. Oh, and we're going to give you Google Maps and Gmail and the Google Play Store, but you also need to join this thing called the Open Handset Alliance, which prevents you from competing against us. So you can't go work with Amazon or Windows when they want to launch their own competitive phones. Now, the irony is the EU has tried to blow up that partnership or that Open Handset Alliance, but it's too late. Even if that handset alliance does not exist today, it's irrelevant because they have the network. How hard is it to get an app developer to make an app for 3 different operating systems? Pretty much impossible. Now there's 2 winners, and a third operating system coming into the smartphone industry will probably not happen. So Oscar is an interesting example where Google's put over $400 million into that. If you take a step back and think about Oscar from a health insurance standpoint, connecting consumers with healthcare providers. And they have built all custom technology on that stack from end to end. Claims processing to telehealth to self-service tools. And they are now giving that away to Humana and other insurance companies, to Cleveland Clinic and other healthcare providers in exchange for access to the network. Here's our software. Use it to make your business more efficient. Give us access to your network. They will do that trade all day long. So there's more research on this around Google, development platforms, Amazon, and B2B distribution. Happy to send you those materials if it's of interest. But I wanted to end now with some time to open it up for some questions. I think right here in the front.
Hello, I'm Karen Conway. Full disclosure, I work for Global Healthcare Exchange, which is an exchange platform formed by Johnson & Johnson, Baxter, Abbott, GE, and Medtronic about 18 years ago. So we do provide a platform. One of the questions that we get from a lot of our medical device manufacturers is concern about counterfeit products. We had the discussion earlier about cybersecurity. This remains an issue. As we move to more things like these kinds of open platforms, how do we address that?
Yeah, it's if you were to think about how to compete against Amazon, that could be a great approach, which would be synergistic with, again, a lot of the brand and traditional businesses that are in this room. SC Johnson is interesting. They've been obviously under siege on the consumer product standpoint. They have a heavy B2B distribution business, and they launched essentially this standard to rate the supply chain and the materials that are going into SC Johnson's products, and then they open this up for other product manufacturers to also join in and be evaluated and follow the standard. So one of the 4 core functions of the platform business model, which we talk about in the book, is this idea of setting rules and standards. So if you think you're kind of the mayor of a town, you're curating access into that ecosystem and you're curating usage. You're weeding out bad players and promoting good players. So what kind of rules and standards could a marketplace spun up by the medical device and the medical supply industry have to better protect that end customer, right? From a kind of branding of a marketplace and values that would resonate with that end customer, I think that's certainly on their mind and obviously of a lot of importance. And who else would understand how to better regulate that than the folks in this room? It's a good point. No? Up? In the middle?
Hi. Is this on? Yes? No? How prepared is this on? Yes? No? Can people hear me? Yeah, I'm good at shouting. How prepared is Amazon? Oh, now it's working. How prepared is Amazon to go into more highly regulated spaces like the medical device space? It's different for Amazon to sell groceries as compared to distributing medical devices under its own label, which could subject it to regulatory oversight.
Testing? Okay, there we are. So the question was around how can Amazon support selling more regulated devices and ensuring that those checks and balances are in place? And they actually have built out a lot of those tools already and are using them for a number of regulated devices in the medical supply industry. That quotation from Chris Holt, Amazon's healthcare lead, earlier up in that interview with him, he was describing how doctors and healthcare providers can go in and choose all the different kind of level of certification or permissioning that they would want from the suppliers that they get to have access to. And those permissions and controls can be set on an organizational or a procurement level to help standardize that and simplify it throughout the organization. And as a result of making sure all of those checks are put in at the organization level, they were attributing, this wasn't independently fact-checked, but they were attributing that the procurement divisions had a 50% reduction in labor when actually going and using Amazon as their procurement destination, bringing a lot of that friction out and weaving those checks and balances directly into the procurement tool, which is Amazon. All right, I think that's it from the crowd. Thank you so much for having me.